Hi there, folks. We are talking today about crop rotation. And so we have been talking about cover cropping, green manures and cover crops. We've talked about building fertility, and we've talked about plant nutrients, and we've also talked about a bit about crop pests. Crop rotation is kind of really at the center of all this. And essentially what it is the planting of different crops over a period of time on the same ground. So the area of land can be 1,000 acres, or it can be 10 by 10 square in your front yard. The period of time can be a 10-year rotation, or it can be a 1-year rotation. I can't imagine it being much shorter than that. But basically, it's planting different crops in the same space, and ideally having a rotation where you're planting one crop here, and then the next year or the next season you're planting it somewhere else, and then somewhere else, and eventually, if you have an actual rotation, it can come back to that same spot after a period of time. And the reason why we do this, why we rotate crops rather than planting the same thing in the same place, is there are many reasons. The main ones are keeping pests and disease from building up in the environment. Okay, so this is probably one of the main reasons that people do crop rotation. When you grow a crop, like for instance, green beans, there are certain pests that affect green beans. They are specific to green beans. And at the end of your green bean harvest, when you pull your crop out, there's a certain number of those pests or those diseases that could be in the soil or they could be in the surrounding environment. If you go back and plant green beans in that same spot, those diseases and those pests are waiting to attack your green bean and they'll get a head start on it. So by rotating and planting something different there, you give the environment a chance to kind of get rid of those pests. They no longer have their favorite food to infect or to eat. And so they will, in theory, go away while different crops are growing. And then after a period of time, you can come back and plant green beans and they will be relatively free of pests and disease. The second thing is pulling different nutrients out of the soil at different times. Okay, every crop has specific nutrients that it uses more of than other nutrients. And by rotating it, we're spreading that out and we're allowing the soil to kind of replenish and repair itself. And whatever fertilization we're doing can fill in those gaps. If you keep pulling the same nutrients out of the same soil by planting the same crop over and over again, then it's going to become deficient in certain nutrients. Even when you're manuring it, if you would have to apply the perfect fertilizer with the exact nutrients of that crop over and over again if you're going to keep growing that same crop. When you rotate, then you can prevent the deficiencies of certain nutrients. Third thing, planting different crops appropriate for the season. Okay, now this is kind of some common sense stuff, but you don't plant corn in fall, you plant corn in spring. And therefore, if you're going to plant something else in the fall, maybe a fall cover crop, or maybe you're planting winter rye or something else that is going to grow over the winter, you're already setting up crop rotation just by planting things that are appropriate to the season. You're also getting more use out of your land by, instead of just growing one crop and then pulling it out and leaving the ground bare, you're planting something else during that off season. Fourth thing, providing varied income for the farmer. Okay, so this is the old putting all your eggs in one basket scenario. if you have a crop rotation, like we're going to talk about, you're going to have multiple crops every year rather than the same crop every year. So if one of those crops, if the price collapses and you can't get any money or you can't find a market for that crop, you have other options. You're not going to be without anything. You're not going to be completely screwed for that year. And the last thing is, if it's done right, this can reduce weeds doing a crop rotation. So say you have a piece of land. We'll call this rectangle an acre of land. What would happen if you looked at your options for different crops and corn was the most profitable crop and that you were geared up to grow, and so you just only planted corn because it looked like your best money-making option? What's going to happen? Well, it might work great that first year, and then what are you going to do the next year? If you plant corn year after year, what will happen? It will deplete the soil of nitrogen and other other corn-specific nutrients. It will build up the insect pests and diseases specific to corn. And it will also build up corn-specific weeds. So weeds are something that there's so many different kinds of weeds, and weeds pop up and thrive and are able to make seeds and fulfill their life cycle and make more weed seed when they have an ideal environment. So the environment in a corn patch is a very specific environment. There's usually a lot of bare soil, but it's kind of shaded, partially shaded. So there's certain weeds that are going to thrive in that environment. And if you're growing corn year after year, those specific weeds that thrive in that environment are going to keep thriving and get worse and worse until they are going to start choking out the corn seed as it's germinating, and it's going to be a serious competition with your crop. They're also putting the farmer at an economic risk, because if all you're growing is that one corn crop, then what if that crop fails? What if you have a big pest or disease outbreak? What if the price of corn plummets? Then you're in real dire straits, as opposed to having a diverse field and diverse sources of income. If the corn doesn't work out, something else will. And finally, you're getting limited use out of the land. If that's all you're planting and you don't have another crop that's going in the winter at the very least, then you could be growing more food, you could be making more money, and you're not utilizing that land to the fullest. So instead of taking that acre of land and just planting corn on it over and over again, what you can do in a typical rotation is you're going to cut that land up into sections, and you are going to plant different things in those sections depending on your rotation scheme. And we'll talk about different rotation schemes in a minute. And then you're going to basically develop that rotation by planting corn in this case, the top left quadrant is going to be corn, and then the following year it'll be where the beans were, and then the following year after that it'll be where the onions were, and then the following year after that it will be where the potatoes were. Even though in reality it's always going to be following the bean crop, because everything's going to move basically counterclockwise, if that makes sense. So any given piece of land, this upper left-hand quadrant, it will be corn first, then it will be potatoes, then it will be onions, then it will be beans, and then it will be corn again. So there's a rotation going on in each quadrant, and then there's the overall rotation. Different ways of looking at it. So I'm just going to flip through some examples of crop rotations. So the simplest and oldest type of crop rotation, this is what I learned when I first learned about crop rotation, breaks crops up into three groups. You have your heavy feeders, you have heavy givers, and you have light feeders. And you rotate those through. You follow a heavy feeder always follows a heavy giver, and then then the light feeder follows the heavy feeder, if that makes sense. So it actually goes in this direction. It goes heavy feeder, light feeder, heavy giver. Now, what does that mean? Heavy feeders are things that eat up a lot of nitrogen, basically. They are heavy feeding crops. So this is all of your grains, corn, wheat, rice, any grain crop is a heavy feeder. Tomatoes are heavy feeders. Most of your fruiting crops, so tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, all of your melons, all of your cucurbits, your squashes, cucumbers, all of those are heavy feeders. Heavy givers. What are heavy givers? These are legumes. Okay, so this is beans, peas, alfalfa, clover. These are all leguminous crops that are nitrogen fixing. These are your heavy givers. And then your light feeders are all of your root crops. So this includes carrots, rutabagas, parsnips, radishes, potatoes, onions, garlic. These are all light feeders. Oh, and I forgot, in the heavy feeder category are also most of your greens crops. So your spinaches, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, these are all heavy feeders also. There are a few crops that it's hard to define, like lettuces. Some people would say those are light feeders, some people would say they're heavy feeders. But it's just a simple system to kind of break it up into these small little groups, and then you can set up your rotation always based on heavy giver, heavy feeder, light feeder, that rotation. Okay. And then here's another diagram that breaks that three crop rotation thing up into the groups again. They call them high feeders and low feeders and givers, but it tells you a little bit more what's what. One thing you might notice, if this is your crop rotation and you're giving equal time and equal space to these crops, there's more plants that you might want to grow in the high feeder or heavy feeder category, and many fewer in the heavy giver category. Yeah, that's how those things work out. So you need to devise your crop rotation to work with your system. That's why it gets more complicated. So this just kind of basically sums up the pest control situation. Growing a single crop year after year in the same field provides a continuous supply of food and breeding facilities for a crop pest. This results in an increased pest population. Now, generally, pests have a narrow host range, meaning they like one or two plants or a few plants, and the eggs are laid before the new crop is planted. Then basically the pest has ready access to that crop. This is an example of crops being very closely related. Okra and cotton, for example, are very closely related, and the same pests can feed on both of them. So that's why it says okra following a cotton crop will increase a pest infestation. Therefore, cotton should be rotated with a different crop that is unrelated, like corn, rice, or peanut. Another way of looking at this that a lot of farmers do is they break it up into kind of groups of plants. They could be plant families. So in this case, they're breaking up their squash and watermelons are in the same family. And they're trying to give those space to alleviate pest pressure from the insects that infect squash and melons. And so their rotation will be squash, corn, potatoes, corn, cabbage, tomatoes. Notice tomatoes are the same color as potatoes, same plant family. Watermelon, corn, potatoes, squash, and so on. It depends on your crops in your area. In Northwest here, we have clubroot, which is a problem. So rotating your brassicas, giving them a long rotation. Brassicas are your broccoli cabbage family. Giving them a long rotation is a good thing, a couple years at least. In other places, there might be other pests that are more of a problem for other groups of plants. Whatever the problems are in your area, those are the plants that you want to make sure you rotate out of any given plot or bed or piece of land, rotate them out and grow other things for a period of at least a year or two before you bring them back. Other ways of breaking them up, these guys have a root group followed by potato family, which is tomato and potato, followed by our legumes, which are also known as the givers, the heavy givers, followed by brassicas, which is that cabbage broccoli family. Sorry, this one is blurry. This is an example of how a lot of large-scale farms do their crop rotation. So you can see year 1, they're growing soybeans. Year 2, they're growing wheat. Year 3, they're growing potato. Year 4, that field will be sown in grass and they'll grow hay. And then they start back over. Now, again, this is in one plot. So in what they're calling year 1, they're growing soybeans here. In the next field over, they might be growing their wheat. In the field next to that, they might be growing potatoes. And the field next to that, they might be growing hay. So all of these crops, they will grow continuously year after year, but they keep growing them in different fields. That's how a rotation works. So these rotations can be flexible. Here's an example of what they're calling their big fruit, big feeders, tomatoes and eggplants and things, followed by a light feeder, which is a root crop like carrots. And then they have two options after the light feeder. Either they grow a heavy giver, like a nitrogen fixer, beans or peas or something, or they're going to apply manure. Okay, either way, they're replenishing the soil's nitrogen before growing the heavy feeders, in this case, the brassica family, and then followed by a nitrogen fixer again. And then they'll come back to the big fruit feeders, and the cycle continues. And between the nitrogen fixer and the big fruit heavy feeder, there is another manuring of the soil. So a lot of times, once these systems are set up, they're definitely not set in stone, and farmers and gardeners will adjust according to how their crops behave, how the soil looks, or what they want to eat and what they want to grow and sell. This is another way of breaking up these crops. I do not know why potatoes is in the legume category, but they're breaking it up into legume, root, fruit, and leaf. Another way to break it up, root, legume, and then the brassica cabbage family and the cucurbit family, which is melons and squashes. So again, there's so many different ways of devising your crop rotation. In this layout, you can see what it might actually look like over a period of time at any given moment. So year one, like we were talking about with the big farm example, year one, bed one would have potato family, bed two would have legumes, bed three would have brassicas, bed four would have onion family. Year two, all of those would shift over one. Year three, so on and so forth. So you're growing the same crops year after year, and you may be growing the same amounts of the same crops, but it's just where they're planted is shifting. Here is another crop rotation example. So this is a little graphic of somebody testing the weed problems in different crop rotations or lack thereof. And they're showing right here that growing straight corn, weed outcome is poor, meaning lots of weeds and weed problems. As soon as they include a simple rotation where they just alternate between corn and soybeans, that improves the weed outcome right away. If they add a third crop, wheat, in there, then it gets even better. And the best is when they do 3 crops followed by alfalfa. Okay. Another example, they're doing root and bulb, fruit and seed, leaf and stem crops. So they don't even have a rotation for legume crops. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is including cover crops in that rotation. Now, cover crops are something that's really important, which I talked about before. I did a video on it. Cover crops can build your soil. They can replenish nitrogen in the case of green manures. This is a perfect example of a mixed cover crop where you have grasses that are building the organic matter in a really big way and helping to eliminate weed competition. And you have some legumes in there to fix nitrogen. Now, the way we would work cover crops into a crop rotation, it can be an every year thing or it can be on a bigger cycle. A lot of times people will do a cover crop on a larger cycle, and this is a good example of that. So they have a fallow period that goes, basically that goes until August, and then they're planting their winter wheat in August, and that goes into year 2. They're going to harvest their winter wheat. They're going to plant a cover crop in fall. That's going to grow over the winter, turn it in spring, and then plant corn. And it looks like when they harvest their corn, they're going to go back into a fallow period. Now, I'm not particularly fond of fallowing. I think I would always rather grow a cover crop than a fallow. So again, here's a crop rotation, and this is also a 3-year cycle. Now you can see right here in November, they're planting their cover crop. Right after they pull their corn out, they're planting their cover crop, turning that in spring, planting a crop of soybeans that is harvested in fall, followed by a crop of winter wheat that is harvested the following summer. And then they're going back into a cover crop in fall, winter, turning it in spring, and then growing a crop of corn and harvesting that in fall, going back into cover crop. So you can see here, they're kind of following a similar path where they're growing cover crop and then they're growing a legume, the soybean in this case, followed by a heavy feeder, which is the wheat. Then they're going back into a cover crop and growing another heavy feeder, which is corn. And for farmers, it's really a matter of what crops do you want to grow that are going to make you money, and how can you maximize your land and at the same time, at least maintain, if not build, your fertility while you're making money growing those cash crops. The nice thing about cover crops is a lot of them you can grow over winter. And so it's really an off season for your cash crops. And so you can be building the soil when you're not making money. And yeah, when you get your system going, it makes it really simple, because if you have a good crop rotation laid out in a garden or a farm, it tells you exactly what's going to go where when. So you know when you pull out this lettuce, the next thing that you're going to plant is your soybeans, right? Or whatever your rotation is. There's a clear succession, and then you have predictability. And assuming it works and it goes well, you get really productive, healthy crops. Here's a little example of what it would actually look like in a small garden with raised beds. So in conclusion, crop rotation is the planting of different crops over time on the same ground. It's done for many reasons, including keeping pests and disease from building up in the environment, pulling different nutrients out of the soil at different times so that you're not depleting your soil of specific nutrients, planting different crops appropriate for the season, providing varied income for the farmer, and reducing weeds. And I hope this was helpful and informative for you guys. Thanks a lot.